are excited to hear from our speaker today. Dr. Stephanie Bair grew up on Prince Edward Island, Canada. She completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Prince Edward Island, studying physics. She was able to receive a research grant from the BYU Physics Department and spent the summer of her junior year of college in Utah. It was her first introduction to BYU and living in Utah. Her time in Utah as an undergraduate student led her to choose to attend the University of Utah for her graduate studies, where she got her PhD in neuroscience. She later decided to pursue law and received her law degree from Harvard Law School. Dr. Bair worked as a lawyer for a while and then decided she wanted to become a law professor. Before coming to teach at BYU Law School, she was an academic fellow at Stanford in the Neuroscience and Society program. She's been an associate professor at the BYU Law School for the last 5 years. Dr. Bair enjoys spending time outdoors and hiking. She has a 3-year-old son, and they love to bake, cook, and enjoy nature together. Now Mariah will introduce Dr. Bair's research interests.
Hi, Dr. Bair's research focuses on the mind, sciences, innovation, and the law. She is particularly interested in applying empirical work in psychology and neuroscience to current legal and policy challenges. Her recent research has explored how poverty impacts decision-making and what this means for innovation, criminal law, and distributive justice. Her most recent article discovered that reducing poverty increases innovation and was selected for the Yale /Harvard/Stanford Junior Faculty Forum. Dr. Bair was inspired to go into her research when she was in a lab with a man as a principal investigator. She found she was the only woman in the entire lab, which she didn't think very much of at the time, but upon later reflection, she sees that there was a particular way things were being done. And the environment wasn't overtly sexist, but there were a number of norms operating in that lab that made challenges for her that her male colleagues didn't face. There simply wasn't enough women in the lab, so not many women were there to set those norms in the way of doing things. And then Dr. Bair will explain her research more in depth.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you guys today. Thanks, Allison and Mariah, for that great introduction. And thanks to Dr. Hegstrom for running this colloquium. I think it's such an important field of study. And I'm really glad to see that so many of you here at BYU are interested in it. So the research I'm going to talk about with you today lies at the intersection of a lot of different fields. So psychology and sociology, innovation research, and gender studies. And in many ways, the research is an outgrowth of my own education and experiences, as you've already heard a little bit about. So currently, I work in the law school, and as a legal scholar, my particular focus is on how innovation happens, and in particular, how legal and extra-legal institutions can promote innovation. But as Allison and Mariah mentioned, I also have a degree in neuroscience, so I'm really interested in the psychology and the psychological underpinnings of innovation. What are some of the psychological and social forces that motivate people to create and to innovate, and what are some of the forces that might get in the way of that and impede them from innovating and creating? Having spent a lot of time in a life sciences lab where we were trying to innovate and develop new ideas and test hypotheses, I have a little bit of firsthand experience with how the whole process of innovation and scientific research takes place. And as a woman who with some experience in science, first as a physics undergrad, and then as a neuroscience PhD student, I have some experience of what it's like to be a woman in science and how gender dynamics might play a role in directing how innovation happens. So that's a little bit of just the background of how I came to this research project. So let me tell you what the specific research project is that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I have a co-author, Laura Pedraza-Farina, who's at Northwestern University Law School. And we're studying how gender norms affect, for either good or bad, the process of innovation. And specifically, our specific area of focus is innovation that occurs in life sciences labs that are headed by women PIs or principal investigators. So labs that are run by women. I want to start with a huge disclaimer, which is that this is going to be an empirical project, which means we're hoping to collect some data, but we haven't actually begun collecting any data or analyzing it yet, in part because of some complications that have arisen due to recent events with COVID. So what I want to do in the discussion today is just give you some background on the project and some of the questions that we have been asking and that we're hoping to gain some insights into, and just to get you thinking about the topic and some of the issues. So to start from the very beginning, I told you that I'm an innovation scholar, which means I study how innovation happens and try to figure out ways that we can promote innovation. But first, I'm going to put you guys on the spot and ask you a couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind responding in the chat bar. What do you think innovation is? It's kind of a it's a word that gets thrown out a lot, but what does it actually mean? Does anyone have any thoughts? Changes or ideas that lead to improvement, technology, creation, new ideas, inventions, progression, positive change, optimizing efficiency, creating new things, the evolution of knowledge, improvements, new methods, improving things that have already been invented, and improving efficiency. Yeah, these are all wonderful answers, and these all fall under the really broad umbrella of innovation. Right? And so usually when we talk about innovation, when scholars talk about innovation, they talk about it in positive terms, as if it's a good thing, right? That innovation is good. But I just want to drill down on that a little bit too. Why do we think that innovation is a good thing? And why is it something that we might want to promote in our society? We want to progress. Air conditioning, yeah, that's a great innovation that has made our lives better. We want to improve lives, makes life easier, more interesting. We need solutions for things, or maybe there are problems we don't even know that we were dealing with that can be solved by innovation. Simpler ways to do things, fostering change, saving on production costs, improving quality of life. I think you're right, that we all have an innate desire for improvement and progression, right? So these are all reasons why we think that innovation is a good thing and something that we want to promote. Kind of on a more technical note, economists often say that innovation promotes economic growth, right? When companies innovate, it tends to create new jobs, which raises the standard of living for everyone across the board. Ideally, it doesn't always work out that way, but at least in theory, that's the idea, right? And so it promotes economic growth, which helps raise the standard of living and gives people more money in their pockets. And it also gives us, new particular products and services that hopefully improve our lives, right? Whether that's air conditioning, as someone mentioned, or medical advances, new drugs. Amazon is a great one, right? There is, a set of the literature that questions this kind of unrelenting positive spin on innovation, because not all innovations necessarily improve our quality of life. You can think about what you think about nuclear weapons, for example. That's an innovation, and some opioids, right? And some innovations have good and bad. Opioids have helped a lot of people, but have also caused a lot of problems. And so there is that aspect to innovation, that not all innovation is necessarily good and positive, but in general, economists, legal scholars, people working in this field think that innovation is generally a good thing that we want to try to promote as much as possible. So given that a lot of people in my field focus, especially me working in the law school, as I said, a lot of people focus on what the law and what the government can do to promote innovation. So you might have heard about patents and copyrights, different forms of intellectual property, right? So can we offer patents which give people exclusive rights to their inventions to help them make some money off their invention and hopefully encourage them to innovate? What about government grants to help promote specific types of research or specific types of innovation that we're interested in? Or tax breaks. Those are all strategies that people in my field talk a lot about in terms of their ability to promote innovation. But another group of scholars has proposed that maybe we don't need as much government innovation or government intervention as you might initially think to promote innovation. Because innovation often happens in communities. We all sometimes think of the inventor as being kind of the lone genius, sitting in his bathtub or under the apple tree or whatever. But in fact, a lot of innovation happens in groups, in labs, in startups, in the university settings. And so what this other group of scholars has proposed is that maybe the social norms that arise in these communities give people the social and the psychological motivation that they need to innovate without government intervention. So, for example, a big reason we offer patents and copyrights to people is to protect their inventions from being copied by others. But if we have strong social norms against copying in particular communities, maybe we don't need patents and copyrights. And patents and copyrights are kind of costly interventions. So if we don't need them, then maybe we shouldn't be using them. And maybe there are other norms that arise in communities that promote innovation, like a sense of shared purpose and togetherness that help get creative juices flowing and promote innovation. So overall, this group of scholars that has talked about social norms and innovation has been very optimistic about how social norms are beneficial for innovation and can help promote innovation. But I'm a pessimist by nature. Not really. I'm an optimist also. But whenever you can, as students and kind of future thinkers, one little piece of advice I have is, if you ever get in a situation where everyone is 100% optimistic and on board with a particular approach or a particular way of thinking, then the first thing you should do is think about the other side of the coin and what might the downsides be to that particular approach or that particular way of thinking. right? And so, there are all these people who are optimistic about social norms and innovation. But my co-author, Dr. Pedraza Farinha, and I thought that these scholars might be overlooking something. And specifically, because we were both familiar with social norms more broadly through our backgrounds in psychology and sociology, we were aware that social norms can often have a dark side. So social norms are good in many, many ways. They promote many beneficial and pro-social behaviors. So, for example, the reason why we're often polite to strangers and kind to strangers arises largely through social norms of behavior, right? So social norms can be good. And they can even promote innovation in the ways that these scholars I told you about have written about. But particularly when social norms get over enforced, they can lead to negative outcomes. And we suspected that might be true for innovation as well. So we got together and we wrote a paper about how social norms might interfere with and impede innovation. So to give an example that we wrote about in our paper, conformity is a really strong psychological drive that we all have. And social norms in communities tend to emphasize conformity. What do I mean by conformity? Well, you guys are all students. Have you ever felt the pressure to conform in any way to what your peers were doing? I see lots of nods, yes. So, on many, many levels. The music that you might listen to, the clothes that you wear, the shows that you watch on TV, the types of friends you interact with, what you do on the weekends, right? All of those things. We have a drive to be part of our social groups and to conform with what our peers are doing. And there are lots of positive outcomes to that. I mean, when we conform, we take advantage of kind of the larger social wisdom, right? We get the advantages that come with belonging to a peer group, all of those things. So conformity is not necessarily bad, but when it's over-enforced, it can lead to bad outcomes, right? So it can lead people to engage in behaviors that actually are not beneficial to them or to others. And particularly in the sphere of innovation, which we were interested in, we talked about how conformity could be bad for innovation, right? Because if you're at a startup or if you belong to a particular scientific community and there's a strong social pressure to conform with certain ways of thinking, certain ways of doing things, certain research methods and techniques, then that is potentially going to prevent people from thinking outside the box and coming up with truly innovative ideas. So we wrote that paper about kind of the dark side of social norms and how social norms might interfere with innovation in some situations. And after we wrote that paper, we started to think, what are some of the other social norms that might interfere with innovation? And as we're both women who have PhDs in life sciences, our thoughts naturally turn to how gender norms might affect the way that innovative ideas get developed and disseminated. So our project, which again, we haven't started collecting data on, but we hope to get that started soon. What we want to do is interview women who are the heads of life sciences labs to see and get their thoughts and their ideas on how gender norms in their scientific communities, in their families, and in their communities more broadly might be affecting their innovative choices and their ability to innovate. Because we do have there is some data out there on this. What we do know is that even though women make up over half of life sciences and engineering PhDs, they are severely underrepresented in the number of patents that they produce. And patents are often seen as a measure of how innovative a particular person is being. So even though women make up over half of life sciences and engineering PhDs, only 10% of inventors listed on patents are women. And so although you have, lots of smart, experienced, talented women out in the world who are potentially, or who, have the potential to innovate, it seems like they're under innovating. And that's a problem not just for the individual women involved. Yeah, I did say 10%. Yeah, 10%. So it's not just a problem for the women, but it's also a problem for society, because if you think that innovation is good for all of the reasons that we talked about, progress and coming up with new ideas and all of these types of things, it means that there's lots of untapped innovative potential out there, right? People who could be innovating, in particular women who could be innovating, and we expect them to be innovating and to be contributing in this way. But for some reason, that innovation is just not taking place. And there are potentially lots and lots of reasons why that could be occurring. But we thought, my co-author and I thought, that social norms could perhaps at least help explain some of these disparities. So what I want to do now is just throw out some possibilities and some ideas that might get you thinking. And this is kind of our framework for our interviews for talking to these women. And we hope that by talking to these women, we'll get even more insights. And I'd be happy to hear your insights as well. But I'm just going to talk about a list of possibilities of how gender norms might potentially be affecting innovation by women in various ways. Okay, so these are some questions that we have. So do gender norms influence the types of projects that women who are the head of labs choose to pursue? For example, do they feel pressure to choose projects that are more accepted by the general scientific community? Do they steer away from more risky projects because they feel more pressure as women to prove themselves and establish a track record? Is there any way in which gender norms are in either subtly or more overtly influencing the types of projects that women who are in these innovative settings choose to pursue? That's one question. A second question is whether gender norms potentially affect funding opportunities. Because if you've ever worked in a lab, a university lab, you know that a lot of the money comes from applying for grants from the government and other sources. So how are women doing in getting funding for their projects? Do they feel like they are more limited in the range of ideas that they can propose as compared to their male colleagues? Do they feel like they have more success when they apply for a grant with a male co-investigator versus a woman co-investigator or solo? Do they believe that gender norms are operating in any way to affect their ability to get money to do their innovative research? A third question, this is kind of a two-part question, but how might gender norms be influencing the time that women spend on innovative work? So the first part to this question involves what women are doing at home in their families. So are there norms in their families where they are expected to spend more time on housework and childcare, for example? We know, statistically speaking, that women do spend significantly more time on housework and childcare than their male partners, even when both parties work full-time. And even when both parties have very egalitarian views and they set out initially to share the workload equally, we still find that women end up spending more time on housework and childcare. And I think that brings up an important point, which is that, you know, we might think of the ways that women are being influenced in terms of their ability to innovate as some kind of overt bias or overt forces or overt sexism that they're confronted with. And that could be true. I don't want to rule out the possibility that that's happening. But I think that there also could be much more subtle influences in terms of these gender norms that even people who overtly, you know, want to be egalitarian, claim that they are feminists and have that outlook, both men and women might still be influenced by these gender norms and conforming to these gender norms. So I'll give you another example. There was a study that found that when a woman was the primary breadwinner in her relationship, she actually ended up spending more time on housework and childcare than in a situation where the woman and the man were kind of equally contributing to the household finances. That seems counterintuitive, right? Because if the woman is working harder and bringing in more money outside the home, you'd think that she would be spending less time on housework duties. But what the researchers thought was going on was that because the woman was violating gender norms in that particular way by being the primary breadwinner, she felt pressure to compensate for that by doing even more work around the house, right? And so this is just a way that gender norms could be really subtly influencing the way that both men and women act in ways that could be, detracting from women's ability to innovate, because obviously the more time that women have to spend on housework and childcare duties, the less time they have to be in the lab working on innovative projects. So part two of that involves gender norms within the lab and the university environment itself, right? So there could be norms within the workplace that prevent women from spending as much time on innovative work as their male colleagues. So for example, there is some evidence that students might be more prone to seek out women professors for mentoring. Do you find in your own experience that is true? Maybe, maybe not, right? But, because of these gender norms where women are seen as being potentially more nurturing, potentially more open and available to these types of mentoring relationships, students, unless you don't have any women professors, sadly, which might be the case for many of you. But this is a way, and not to say that mentoring students is a bad thing at all, right? It's a wonderful thing, and it's something that both men and women professors should be doing. But if women professors are doing it more, then that means that they have less time than their male colleagues to spend on, research and pure innovative work. Right? Are there norms that require women to perform more committee work or people-facing duties, which again could detract from their opportunities to innovate? Another question, do gender norms affect the quality and quantity of collaboration that women are able to engage in? So we know that collaboration often leads to really groundbreaking, innovative work. When people collaborate, they're often able to come up with more creative and innovative ideas than they are when they're working by themselves. But do gender norms affect the ability to attract high quality collaborators in any way? If, for example, for historical reasons, all the leaders in the field are men, is it more difficult for women to establish collaborative relationships with these high-profile male colleagues? Maybe, maybe not, right? We don't know for sure the answers, but these are questions that we'd like to ask. Another question, do gender norms affect the quantity and quality of employees that women heads of labs are able to attract? So a good lab depends in large part on the quality of its employees, right? The graduate students, the postdoctoral researchers. So do women have a harder time attracting high quality employees, both male and female? And if they do hire male employees, do gender norms influence in any way the employer-employee relationship, right? In ways that are potentially problematic? Is it harder for the woman head of the lab to kind of assert her vision in an authoritative way with a male postdoctoral researcher versus a female postdoctoral researcher? So that's a question. And finally, do gender norms affect the dissemination and reception of innovative outputs? Because it's not just about innovating, it's about getting your ideas out there and having people listen to your ideas and adopt your ideas, right? And so are gender norms influencing the way that ideas generated by women get out into the world? And we do also have a little bit of empirical evidence on that. And so one study found, for example, that when you controlled for female names versus male names at the patent office, if you controlled for the quality of the patents, but you varied female names versus male names, what this study found was that patents with female sounding names were granted significantly less often by the patent office than patents with male sounding names. The same study also found that patents with female sounding names were cited less often by future patents and by other researchers. And so not only were women being granted patents less often, but they were also, when they were granted patents, those patents weren't making as big of a splash in terms of other people referring to those patents and citing those patents. There's another recent study that focused on the field of neuroscience in particular. And what that study found was that women researchers in neuroscience were undercited compared to their male colleagues. And when they drilled down on that, they found that men in particular tended to cite other men. Women cited men and women equally, but men put a definite thumb in the scale of citing other men. And because the field is male dominated, this led to this feedback loop where women were kind of perpetually being undercited. Okay, so those are some of the ideas of things that we'd like to explore and get more insight into. And I'd also be happy in the Q&A to get your ideas of on any of these things that I've talked about or additional factors that you think might be influencing the potential of women to innovate. What I'd also like to hear from you about is if these things are in fact occurring and that there's at least some preliminary evidence that they are, what can we do about it? Because again, oftentimes it's not overt sexism or bias. And, you know, as Mariah mentioned in my own experience, if anyone asked me, you know, coming up in a lab that was all headed by a man and all male graduate students and all male postdocs, did I ever feel like I was explicitly discriminated against? I would probably say no, right? But there might still be these more subtle forces of people, both male and female, perpetuating perpetuating these norms that are harmful, even people who consider themselves to be very progressive and egalitarian. So if that's the case, what can we do about it? How can we go about changing these norms? I think the first step is to actually uncover the norms and show what they are and how they're operating, which is why we're doing this research. But ideally, we don't want to stop there. And I think it's important to note that social norms are not, something that's set in stone that can never be changed. So we shouldn't throw up our hands and give up. So to give a really recent and salient example, we've had a huge shift in social norms come about because of COVID, right? A big shift in a relatively short time with people wearing masks and norms around handshakes and hugs and gatherings. There has, not to say that it's been a complete shift or an entirely successful shift. There's been some pushback for sure. But overall, we've seen a pretty major shift in social norms occur over a relatively short period of time. So I think it is possible to shift social norms and gender norms, but we all need to be thinking about how we can do that. And I think the first step is in identifying that these norms, in fact, exist and that they're operating in ways that might be harmful to individuals and to society as a whole. So I'm going to stop there because I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts and questions on this.
Thank you, Dr. Bair, for your presentation.
Let's all give Dr. Bair a virtual round of applause and Perfect. We feel very lucky to have heard from you today, Dr. Bair, and are encouraged to hear that you are spearheading such important research in regard to the relationship between innovation and gender, examining the role that gender plays within the realm of the life sciences field is integral in examining the role of gender in academia as a whole, and the potentially negative impact that our current social norms can have on the upward mobility of women in specific fields. In addition to this, there are several studies that have shown how women and girls are discouraged and steered away from both science and math throughout their education, which significantly impacts the amount of women who are entering these fields in the first place. And that makes it even more crucial to investigate the experience that women have when already working in the fields, right? So it's so discouraging that like women with female sounding name or just female sounding names in general, right? And are much less likely to get selected for patents. And then the fact that granted patents with women as inventors are much less likely to be cited in future research. We must identify the social and gender norms that play a role in the issues that women face in order to come to a cohesive solution that makes both life science labs and STEM fields as a whole an environment that encourages innovation and fully fosters and utilizes what women have to offer.
I nominate you.
Again, thank you, Dr. Bair, for shedding light on the importance of recognizing how gender norms affect innovation. Your unique perspective as a lawyer and as a PhD holder is especially informative. Through the Global Women's Studies minor, we have the privilege to learn about the harmful effects of gender norms throughout all disciplines. The sciences, as Dr. Bair shared with us, as well as literature, history, politics, and beyond. As we learn about the roadblocks that these norms can present, it is important to find how they apply to our specific discipline and what we can do about them. It is not enough for us to simply be aware of what people like Dr. Bair are doing to bring about equality. We need to be ready to roll up our own sleeves and get to work ourselves. We can each do our part to question gender norms at church, in our education, at the store, and in our interactions with family and friends. As Dr. Bair said, social norms, we are excited to continue to watch the development of your research, and we are thankful for your example. We'll now turn the time over to Halia and Marie for the Q&A.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry, that was my fault. I have really weird feedback on my computer, so I'm using my iPad for my voice. Sorry, that was my fault. I apologize. So the way our question and answer is going to work, people have already started putting questions in the chat. And so we're going to go ahead and ask our first question, and then Dr. Bair will answer, and then Halia will read questions from the chat for Dr. Bair to answer. And we will conclude at the latest 12:55. If you need to leave, that's fine before that, but we will conclude at that time. So I'm going to turn the time over to Halia for the first question.
Perfect. Thank you so much again, Dr. Bair. But for our first question, we have, so for years, women published books under masculine pen names or gender ambiguous pseudonyms. What would you say to women who feel discouraged and are unsure of pursuing a career in STEM fields based on the fact that they are female?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and I think that there are different people have different ideas about the best way to proceed in male-dominated fields. So I'm sure many of you have heard of Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In. She's a CEO of Facebook, and she's not in a STEM field, but definitely kind of in a particularly male-dominated role. And her idea that she has presented in the book is, women need to lean in. They need to just accept that, that these fields are male-dominated, and do whatever they can to kind of prove that they can make it in male-dominated fields. And once they're insiders, then they can start changing the norms. I personally disagree with that. So I think that, in fact, rather than advising women that they need to adopt particular gendered norms in order to succeed in male-dominated fields, that what we need to be having a conversation about is how the norms in particular fields are harmful for both men and women as currently structured, and how we need to change those norms for everyone and for the sake of everyone. Because there's lots of evidence that having women involved in creative groups as equal participants in creative groups actually promotes innovation, promotes problem solving. And so to just say, we need to kind of keep things as they are and somehow make it easier for particular high achieving women to succeed, I think that's wrong. I think we need to start rethinking the whole model of how innovation works in both business and in the STEM field. And so I think the advice that I have for women is, rather than to be discouraged, this is like an amazing opportunity for you to come in there and really shake things up and really start asking questions and imposing your own particular talents and views about how things need to be done in ways that I think, if we get numbers, if we get sufficient numbers of women coming in and doing that we really do have the power to change the way things are done. So rather than be discouraged, I think, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity.
And then another message from the chat is, how do mental health norms intersect with the gender norms to prevent overcoming barriers to innovation?
That's really interesting. It's not something that I have thought about too much, to be honest. But I think there is a lot of stigma around mental health, and I think that the brunt of that stigma often falls upon women, right? That women are seen as being particularly prone to mental health challenges, that they're, that if they're emotional, then that's hysteria or something like this, right? In ways that women are not taken as seriously. And so I think that, mental health, the stigma around mental health is something that needs to be addressed. And again, for the sake of both men and women, right? And I think men are suffering too from the fact that there's a stigma around admitting any kind of weakness, about men showing emotion in any way in the workplace or in their family environments, right? And so when we start removing that stigma, I think it makes for a healthier environment for both men and women. But I also think that, women stand to benefit particularly from the removal of mental health norms and stigma, just because they have been kind of hit so hard by those particular stigmas in the past. But it's an interesting question that I think I can think more about.
And then, are you hoping to study gender norms and innovation in the US alone or on a cross-cultural level?
So our initial plan is in the U.S., but yeah, I think that eventually it would be really interesting to see, are there particular cultural norms that intersect with gender norms in ways that, the gender norms that operate here in innovative environments might be different from gender norms in innovation in other countries. So yeah, I think it's an interesting direction for future research.
And then what impact, if any, do you think that the new COVID social norms from the past few months could have on future innovation?
So interesting you asked that question, because I'm in the middle of writing a paper about that, actually. A co-author at the law school, Clark Acey, and I are writing about how adversity impacts innovation, and using the COVID crisis as an example of adversity. And what we did was we looked to the psychology and sociology literature to kind of figure out what types of adversity are innovation promoting and what types of adversity are innovation inhibiting. And what we found is that something like COVID, as long as as people still have resources in place, like they have money and social support structures and things like that they'll allow them to continue to innovate, kind of the shared sense of community and shared sense of this is a challenge that we're all dealing with together, can actually really mobilize people in ways that are beneficial for innovation. And in fact, you've seen that quite a bit in terms of COVID researchers sharing their research with others in ways that they haven't before, and just the fast track that research is progressing. So I think it's a really interesting time to be studying innovation.
And then we only have time for a few more questions, but as you have worked in the field of life sciences and law, how did the gender norms differ between the two fields in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are gender norms that kind of operate there are gender norms in both fields, but they operate kind of in different ways. And so in life sciences, I would say a lot of the gender norms, but there are similarities too. So I think one of the major similarities that arises across all fields, and I forget who was studying this at BYU, but there was a study that just recently came out of BYU. I think Dr. Karpowitz in the political science department found that when women were part of groups, that women tended to be listened to less often. Their ideas were listened to less often in collaborative groups, unless women made up a majority of that group. And so I think that's kind of a norm that cuts across disciplines, that it's just, for whatever reason, and whether you're talking about law or whether you're talking about science, it's just more difficult for women to get their ideas heard in these types of settings. So that's a similarity. Different, some differences might involve, I think in life sciences, for example, and sciences in general, there's been less of a history of women being involved there. So perhaps the gender norms are a little bit stronger. In the law, gender norms might revolve a little bit more around the ability of women to be assertive, either in the courtroom or in a kind of strategic setting. So there are a lot of similarities, but just some differences depending on what the daily tasks are of the women involved. Yes, Jessica Priest and Chris Karpowitz did that research. Thank you.
And then we just have one more last question. Sorry, a bunch of you will ask you a bunch of awesome questions, but we'll ask one more and then wrap it up. Does the quantitative study include women of color, and how is their innovation impeded by gender and social norms?
Yeah, so we hope to include women of color in this study as well, even though we're going to focus specifically on the gender aspects, at least for this first phase. But I've also written a paper on how the stress that comes from being a racial minority can actually interfere with creative decision making. So there's some evidence that just being a racial minority is extremely stressful. It interferes with sleep patterns. It can change the way that people make decisions day to day in ways that make it harder for people to engage in this type of creative and innovative thought. So that's another topic that I'm really interested in.
Well, thank you to everyone who asked questions, and thank you so much, Dr. Bair, for spending your morning or your time with us and talking about what you're working on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. It was fun. Thank you, guys.